The sound wasn't sharp or dull. It was violent. A thick crystal whiskey glass, the kind reserved for penthouse suites at the Fontainebleau, slammed into the wall like artillery fire. It exploded into a storm of razor-edged fragments, scattering across the deep velvet carpet in every direction. One large shard spun through the air, flashing in the glow of the vanity lights, missing Dean Martin's left eye by barely a few inches. A moment earlier, the dressing room had been alive with laughter and post-show energy. Now it fell into a terrifying stillness. The low hum of the air conditioner filled the space. Somewhere outside, the distant crash of ocean waves could be heard, and beneath it all was the hard, uneven breathing of the most powerful man in entertainment. Frank Sinatra stood in the middle of the room, his boatee hung loose, his collar open, his tuxedo rumpled like it had survived a fight. The face the public knew for control and polish was gone, replaced by raw fury. Veins stood out along his neck. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with rage barely held in check. Across from him, leaning against the makeup counter, was Dean Martin. He didn't react. He didn't glance at the shattered glass inches from where his eye had been. He calmly took a drag from his cigarette, exhaled slowly, and looked at Frank with something that wasn't anger or shock. It was sympathy. In that small room on a humid February night in 1965, time seemed to pause. A young makeup artist named Sarah pressed herself against the wall, one hand over her mouth to silence a scream. Big Tony, the head of security, a man who had witnessed mob violence and street bloodshed, looked genuinely unsettled. This wasn't a simple argument between performers. This was a clash of forces. A rupture in the carefully polished myth of the Rat Pack, exposing the fragile human reality beneath the legend. Everyone knew the image. The kings of Las Vegas, brothers bound by laughter, liquor, and loyalty. But no one spoke about this night. No one spoke about the envy that nearly shattered one of Hollywood's greatest friendships. What unfolded over the next 20 minutes was buried for decades. Until now. This was the night Frank Sinatra nearly destroyed Dean Martin, and the night Dean Martin saved Frank Sinatra without raising a hand. To understand why a glass flew in 1965, you have to understand the pressure crushing Frank Sinatra at the time. The world was shifting fast. Too fast. The Beatles had arrived, and rock music wasn't a phase anymore. It was a takeover. Young people weren't listening to swing or big bands. Their hair was longer, their voices louder, their loyalties elsewhere. And suddenly, a man in a tux crooning to the moon felt outdated. Frank felt that change in his gut. He had been the voice of an era, the chairman of the board, the standard by which success was measured, but the fear of being left behind haunted him. For Frank, fame wasn't optional. It was oxygen. Without applause, he didn't exist. That fear sharpened him into something volatile. Every show had to be perfect. Every noche controlled. The crowd had to be conquered. He wasn't performing anymore. He was commanding. Then there was Dean. Dean Martin lived on the opposite side of that emotional spectrum. He didn't worry about trends. He didn't care about revolutions in music. He barely cared about show business at all. He treated it like a job, not an identity. He showed up, did his part, and went home. He'd rather make a Western or play golf than chase headlines. And that was the cruelty that gnawed at Frank. The less Dean tried, the more people adored him. In 1964, Dean had pushed the Beatles off the top of the charts with Everybody Loves Somebody. Frank hadn't touched #1 in years. Dean's television show dominated ratings while Frank struggled to find his place on the small screen. When they shared a stage, the contrast was unmistakable. Frank pushed himself, sweating under the lights, forcing every note, demanding devotion. Dean would stroll out casually, drink in hand, relaxed and effortless. The audience didn't know the glass usually held apple juice. They didn't care. They only saw a man who made it all look easy. He would mumble a throwaway joke, flash that lazy, half-asleep smile, and the crowd would unravel. They didn't just admire Dean. They wanted to wrap their arms around him. They wanted to be him. Frank commanded respect, but Dean inspired affection. And on this particular night at the Fontainebleau in Miami, that affection turned into something sharp. The Fontainebleau was Miami Beach royalty. It drew politicians, mob figures, and the wealthiest gamblers escaping winter up north. The showroom was overflowing. Nearly 2,000 people packed tight around small tables, cigarette smoke hanging like a bluish haze beneath the lights, diamonds catching flashes as heads turned. The atmosphere felt different that night. Louder, looser. This wasn't a crowd looking for elegance. They came to drink, shout, and celebrate. That's Frank opened the show already irritated. He'd argued with management about sound levels. His head was pounding, and his patience was thin. Hilong instinto, I've got you under my skin. A song that demanded control and restraint. He closed his eyes, building the tension, reaching for that emotional climb he was famous for. From the back of the room, a slurred voice cut through the music. Where's Dino? Frank stopped cold. His eyes snapped open, burning into the darkness. I'm singing, he snapped into the microphone. Have some manners. Nervous laughter rippled through the room. Frank tried to push forward, but before he could settle back in, another shout rang out. Bring out the drunk. Frank waved the band to silence. You know, he said sharply, venom dripping from every word. If you don't like it, you're welcome to leave. I don't need your money. I've got more in my pocket than you'll ever see. The mood shifted instantly. Murmurs spread. A low, uneasy buzz crept across the room. Frank could feel it slipping. He was battling the audience now, and the audience was pushing back. Then the side curtain moved. Dean didn't stride out. Drifted. He staggered slightly, grabbed the piano for balance, and stared at the crowd like he'd wandered into the wrong place. Is this the Basta Steubenville? He mumbled into his lapel, pretending it was a microphone. The tension evaporated in an instant. Laughter rolled through the room like thunder. Gino, Gino, they chanted, then turned to Frank, who stood rigid under the lights. Hey, Frank, he drawled. Why the long face? Somebody shoot your horse. The room exploded. For the next 40 minutes, the energy belonged to Dean. Every time Frank leaned into a serious moment, the crowd waited restlessly until Dean cracked a joke or slipped in a harmony. Dean wasn't trying to steal anything. This was the routine. The contrast was the magic. One straight man, one clown. But tonight, Frank didn't want to be the anchor. He wanted the spotlight. Every laugh Dean earned felt like a blade twisting deeper. Every cheer sounded like rejection. By the finale, Frank's voice was sharp and mechanical. He didn't look at Dean. He didn't look at the crowd. He stared past them, jaw tight, boiling. When the curtain dropped, the applause was overwhelming. Frank didn't bow. He yanked the microphone from its stand, slammed it onto the piano, and stormed off stage. Dean watched him disappear. He waved, smiled, took his bow, and followed him into the shadows. He knew what was coming. He just didn't realize how violent it would be. Back in the dressing room, glass still echoed in the air. Frank's chest heaved. You did that on purpose, he hissed, his voice low and lethal. You saw them turning on me. You knew I was fighting out there, and you piled on. Dean calmly grabbed a towel and wiped his face. I was doing the bit, Frank. That's the act. I play the fool. You play the star. You weren't playing the fool, Frank shouted, stepping forward. You were playing king. You think you're better than me now, don't you? You think because you've got a TV show and a few hits that you don't need me anymore? I never said that, Dean replied evenly. You don't have to, Frank snapped, slamming a chair against the floor. I see it in your eyes. You think this is easy. You think you can just coast through life, sip your drink, play golf, and everything falls into your lap. You don't know what it takes to stay on top. You don't have discipline. This was the heart of Frank's bitterness. He put in 18-hour days just to be Frank Sinatra, while Dean Martin seemed to stumble into legend without effort. You're lazy, Dean, Frank spat. A lazy, gifted bastard who doesn't even respect what he's been given. Sarah, the makeup artist, was shaking now. She'd heard the stories about Frank's temper, about phones thrown through windows and photographers knocked to the ground. She was convinced she was about to witness something irreversible. Dean studied Frank closely. He saw past the fury and into the hurt underneath. He knew this wasn't about the show or the crowd. It was about fear. Frank was terrified that without perfection, he was nothing, that if he wasn't the greatest, he was unlovable. Dean could have hit him. In his younger days, he bucked. His hands were heavy and sure. One punch could have ended it, or he could have destroyed Frank with words. He could have reminded him that charts had moved on. He could have mocked his age, his voice, his insecurity. Any one of those would have shattered the Rat Pack forever. The friendship would have died right there. Instead, Dean did something no one expected. He walked past Frank without a word and crossed the room to the small bar in the corner. Ice melted slowly in the bucket. Bottles reflected the lights. Dean reached for Jack Daniels, Frank's drink, not his own. He poured 2 glasses carefully. The room was silent, except for the steady sound of whiskey filling glass. He returned and stood face to face with the man who had nearly blinded him. Dean held out 1 glass. Frankie, he said. Frank didn't take it. His body was still buzzing with rage. Don't try to cover this up with a drink, Frank snapped. Take it, Dean said again, his voice firm now, steady with authority. Frank hesitated, then met Dean's eyes. You know what your problem is? Dean asked quietly. Frank braced himself. You think you have to earn love every single night. You think if you don't bleed on that stage, they'll stop caring. They will, Frank said softly. That's how this business works. No, Dean replied. That's how you work. Dean took a sip from his glass. Look at me, he said. I'm a lucky break. A guy from Steubenville who caught a wave. I can't sing like you. I can't shape a song the way you do. Nobody can. You're the voice from. There's only one of you. Hey. Paused. When I look at myself, I see a hustler. When people look at you, they see history. He stepped closer, not threatening, just present. Tonight, they laughed at my jokes. Jokes are easy. They're cheap. But when you sang Angel Eyes, I saw people break. I saw tears. I saw hands being squeezed tighter. You moved them. I just kept them busy. That's the difference. It wasn't entirely true. Dean could reach hearts just as deeply. But in that moment, he chose to shrink himself so Frank could stand tall again. He set his ego aside to seal the wound in his friend. Frank's expression collapsed. The anger drained away, leaving raw exposure behind. His lip trembled. The tears that fueled his fury turned into shame. I threw that glass at you, he said quietly. I could have blinded you. Dean shrugged, a crooked smile returning. You're getting old, pal. Your aim's gone. Frank let out a sound that was part laughter, part sob. He reached for the glass, his fingers brushing Dean's. "I'm scared," he admitted. "I feel like I'm losing it." Dean placed a hand on his shoulder and squeezed. "You're not losing anything. You're just holding too tight. Let go a BG. Let me be the clown. Let me take the heat. You just stand there and sing." Frank nodded, wiping his face with his sleeve. He took a long drink and exhaled deeply. The tension dissolved. Sarah finally breathed again. Big Tony relaxed his stance. Dean glanced at the room and smiled faintly. "All right, folks," he said. "Show's over. Just two Italians arguing about opera." He turned back to Frank and spoke evenly. "We've got another set in 20 minutes. You want to pull the plug." Frank adjusted his tie, ran a hand through his hair, and stared at his reflection. His eyes were still red, but the fire had settled into focus. "Conceal," Frank said, "so you can take the night off." "Not happening." Dean laughed, a deep, genuine laugh. "Good. I could use the paycheck. Alimony doesn't pay itself." When the curtain rose for the midnight show, something had shifted. Second shows were usually sloppy, louder, fueled by too much alcohol. This one wasn't. There was a sharpness to it, an almost frightening precision. Frank sang like everything was on the line, but he wasn't battling the crowd anymore. He was loose, confident, generous. When Dean joined him, Frank didn't tense. He welcomed him. During a duet from Guys and Dolls, Dean blanked on a lyric. Normally, Frank would have smirked or jabbed him. Instead, he slid an arm around Dean and whispered the words. Dean grinned at the audience. "Si, hey," said, "he taught me everything I know." The crowd exploded. They saw friendship. They saw joy. They never knew broken glass had been swept up an hour earlier. That night became the finest version of their show. Pure chemistry. Impossible to fake. Afterward, back in the dressing room, the energy drained away. The glass was gone. The carpet looked perfect. Only the memory lingered. Frank sat smoking, staring at nothing. Dean pulled on a gray suit, straightened his jacket, and reached for his hat. "D," Frank said quietly. "Yeah, thanks." Dean didn't ask why. He nodded. "Food?" he said. "I'm starving." "Yeah," Frank replied. "I'll meet you." They never spoke of that night again. Not publicly, not privately. It became one of those unspoken truths. But things changed. Frank never tried to overpower Dean after that. He understood something he hadn't before. Dean wasn't beneath him. He was beside him. His strength wasn't volume or force. It was certainty. Years later, long after the group had scattered and the world had moved on, Frank was asked who mattered most to him outside his family. He didn't name a president or a boss or a lover. He said, "Dean Martin. He was my right arm," Frank said. "Sometimes my heart." And when Dean was nearing the end in 1995, sitting quietly watching old westerns, a friend asked if he missed the fame, the applause. Dean smiled that familiar, sleepy smile. "I don't miss the noise," he said. "I miss the guys. I miss making Frank laugh." Hardest job I ever had. That night in Miami leaves a lesson behind. We're taught that strength is loud, that power comes from rage, from domination, from smashing glass. But the strongest man in that room wasn't the one who threw it. It was the one who stayed steady. Strength is remaining calm when chaos explodes around you. It's carrying someone else's fear without letting it rot you from the inside. It's knowing who you are well enough to step back and let someone else shine because they need it more. Dean, Martin didn't save Frank Sinatra with fists or threats. He saved him with patience, honesty, and a shared drink. Sometimes being a brother means swallowing your pride to keep someone you love from destroying himself. So when you see those famous photos of tuxedos and smiles, remember the shattered glass, the jealousy, and the quiet grace that healed it all.